Sky Cricket Podcast returns after an amazing week of sport, actually. A good second round of the county championship, but brilliant sport at Augusta over the weekend. Where I was up in the lakes, actually, walking up to the top of something called Helvellyn, which is the third highest peak in England. What have you been up to, Nas?
I've been trying to keep myself across this plethora of sport that's going on. The county championship, the Masters, the end of the Premier League, the end of the Champions League, which Arsenal are playing in tonight in Real Madrid. It's all happening. I would love to say I was there at midnight or whenever it ended, 1 o'clock in the morning, watching Rory win the playoff, but I think I snoozed at about 10 o'clock and caught up with
I,
it the next day.
I watched it. I thought it was fantastic sport because it just encapsulated everything. You obviously had, the dream realized, a career fulfilled for McIlroy, a grand slam that he's been trying to complete for such a long time, and all that history of past failures at Augusta. But then on the other side of it, sports like zero-sum game, isn't it? You had the collapse of Bryson DeChambeau, just couldn't cope with it, and came out whinging that McIlroy didn't speak to him at all in the course of 18 holes. You had the grace of Justin Rose, who was there right at the end at the playoff and seemed to handle it with great equanimity and grace. Very interesting. There's been a bit of reflection on the call as well from the American commentator, Jim Nance, which would interest us as commentators. He basically, very short call of McIlroy's winning moment, and then shut up for about 6 minutes, which I like. I think it's far more powerful when you stay quiet and allow the viewers the kind of the noise and the atmosphere, and allow the moment to speak for itself, which is not necessarily the way sports commentary has gone in recent times or is going, but I think it was all the more powerful for that.
Yeah, it's a lesson for us all, actually. Less is more, especially in those key moments. I guess it depends on what the environment is and what the crowd and the actual moments like. If there's no one in, maybe the end of a
Yeah.
county championship game or something, you got to give it
No.
a bit of give it a bit of a boost. But and that moment, that key moment, and history being made, the absolute understanding of what that meant to Rory McIlroy, it was best to keep quiet, and a few commentators did that. I actually enjoyed more the mindset and the mind games throughout that whole tournament, and in particular that last day. I've always found that, you know me, I'm a very complicated, or I was a very complicated player, and the mental side was the hardest thing for me. And the mind games that Rory McIlroy must have gone through and tried to put himself through leading into that tournament and in that last round. He had a sports psychologist. He tried to blank everything, all the history and what had gone wrong in that tournament and previous tournaments, and Bryson DeChambeau right there in front of him after the US Open defeat, and the pain at the Masters. And then he double bogeyed the first. He was two ahead.
No.
He double bogeys the first hole, and the camera went right in close on him. And in that moment, I thought, this is where the mind games are happening. Can he blank out all the previous collapses, or can he say, no, it's not happening this time? And I think he obviously went on to do the latter. The thing I
I
found
mean,
with
the
him
the
as
thing
well.
about that course is that it accentuates all those issues because, around Amen Corner, or, the water around the other holes coming in towards the close. I was there, actually covered the tournament when Tiger had his great win. It must be about 6 years ago now. And the difference was the moment he got ahead, which was just around Amen Corner, you knew he was gonna win it. He didn't make a mistake. It was an epic performance, and I was there covering it for the paper, and you could start almost writing up because you could watch him and know that it was gonna end in a Tiger victory. There was no way when around that time when Rory was ahead there, you wouldn't have been able to do that, but even greater credit to him, I suppose, given that he dunked it in the water and then made those miracle shots to come back.
But that's all I would say about Rory McIlroy. And this might seem a bit harsh for someone who's won so many majors and so many tournaments. is that I feel more confident watching him when he's coming from behind.
Yeah,
When he
yeah.
just gets ahead, that's when I think it might implode here. If he just like he double bogeyed that, it's almost like the pressure was slightly lifted off him. He seems
Yeah,
a better chaser. Tiger Woods, I
yeah.
think, was in the front, in the lead, loved to be chased. I think Rory McIlroy loved to be the chaser. And there ends the end of the
And
Sky Golf podcast.
and great vulnerability that he showed in interviews as well afterwards. He's very open character, and, tears were flowing and lovely things that he said about his caddy and his family. So
And
there
Shane
was a lot wrapped
Lowry.
up
I
in
mean,
that
you
moment.
mentioned Justin
Yeah,
Rose, but Shane Lowry and the tweet he put out or the comment he made about his friendship, he said this was a tournament I was desperate to win,
yeah.
but he couldn't think of a better ending than his mate. There was friendship and mateship in there as well. So it was great scenes. It's what sport, like you said right at the start of this, it is what sport is all about. But for me, it was about that mental scarring and baggage that all sports people have and how you overcome it. It was great watching.
Sir Jimmy Anderson, he's been knighted since our last podcast. Did you ever think that when you gave a first cap to a mute 21-year-old from Lancashire who didn't say a word in the dressing room for about 3 years, that you'd end up be calling him Sir Jimmy Anderson?
No, I can't think in the huddle or whenever I did it. We didn't have a huddle back then. We just sort of handed him the cap. I don't think my speech was, "Here you go, Jim. In 20 odd years' time, you will be Sir Jimmy Anderson." I think we all knew that he was going to be high class. He had such skill about him. And I think it is great to see. They'll have to be up at Old Trafford putting up the Sir Jimmy Anderson. And he's a quiet man, but for him and his family, that will mean a lot. His mate, Sir Alistair Cook, Sir Andrew Strass, who's next on the list? I mean,
Knights, there's knights
Joe Root,
everywhere.
Sir Joseph Root, he'll be next on the list.
Well, he ain't playing at the moment, and nor is Harry Brook, but Yorkshire had a thumping win. Highest margin of victory in the championship, wasn't it, for them at Headingley? Johnny Bairstow captaining at Headingley. And there's some interesting performances and results in the second round of championship, which we've been keeping an eye on. Great match between Warwickshire and Durham that was sealed with a 6 from Ethan Bamber right at the end of that game, but runs in that game for Ben McKinney, who's a kind of highly regarded young opener up there, who's been on the Lions tour. He seems to be almost the one they're talking about as the next man in, which, depending on how Crawley and Pope go, who got some runs, Zak Crawley in the second round, second innings against Middlesex, but the potential absence of Jacob Bethel at the IPL for that first test against Zimbabwe, Ben McKinney's name could be in the shake-up there.
Yeah, he's someone that even before the Lions tour, you sort of hear whispers, and I mentioned Joe Root there. You have these players that before they play for England, before they even appear for the Lions, it happened to our great mate Graham Thorpe. People talk about them, and whispers start to get round the county circuit. Have you seen this lad play? And we all rush to the streams and whatever. And that's what I've been doing recently. He looks like a very, very organised player. Who else has caught your
Well, there's
eye?
a
I
good
mean,
win
Rob
for
mentioned
Sussex.
Josh Young.
Yeah, yeah. Rob Key talked last week, didn't he, about wickets for
Yeah.
Josh Young and how well he'd
Yeah.
bowled. I was interested to see Sussex beat Somerset. Sussex going well. John Simpson having an amazing kind of second career almost at Sussex after a long and successful career at Middlesex, but he's suddenly scoring runs for fun down there. Dom Sibley with a couple of hundreds against Hampshire. Super Kent going well under Adam Hollyoake. No surprise there. I think that's a really good coaching appointment.
Very good coaching appointment. Just two things about that. Firstly, about the point system. Have you looked at the Division 2 table?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Leicestershire are top.
Yeah.
1-1, drawn 1. Kent have
Yeah.
won 2 and are second. It's 8 points for a draw. Now, Kent haven't had a single batting point in
Yeah.
those 2 games. Is it too much weighed towards a draw with 8 points? It came in and, because you wanted sides to value a draw and
Yeah.
batting out and grinding out a draw as opposed to just giving it away. Are you okay with 8 points for a draw?
I prefer to incentivize a win. Was it when did Warwickshire win under 90, having won about 3 games in the season? I think it was 5 actually, but we take the mickey out of
Say
them
3.
for
Say 3.
winning 3. But I think you should incentivise the win, and as you say, that Kent's batters haven't racked up batting points in the first innings, because it looked a very green surface at the start of that game against Middlesex, and then kind of flattened out, which led to very good hundreds for Ben Compton and Tuanda Mayeye, who played really well. Who's not available or eligible for England yet, but were he'd be in the conversation as well. I was just interested to see 11 wickets for Calvin Harrison, who's on loan from Notts to Northants. He played up at Old Trafford. They hung on their Lancs. I mean, Lancs following on to Northants at Old Trafford. My God. Come, if that had have happened about 30 years ago, we'd have all got the sack. But anyway, Calvin Harrison bowled really well. I think he's a really good cricketer, actually, in all attributes of the game. He catches well at slip, bats well, and he got bowled 50 overs in the second innings, I think. Leg spin always a good place, Old Trafford, to bowl leg spin, and I thought he bowled really well as a cricketer. I've had just watched now and again over the last couple of years and just think he's a good cricketer in first class format.
And second point, I know we're going to have Luke Wright come on. We're going to chat with Luke about selection. Just wanted your opinion on this. On the back of Sibley getting runs and having a good start to the season, and it's not a Dom Sibley point, it's a general point about when you should go back to players. My gut feeling with this regime, and you can correct me, they haven't gone back to many people. So if you think of Alex Lees, or who's had a fabulous 3 years, Keaton Jennings, who's played really well, Hamid, Sibley, cricketers that have had a chance, go back even further, Vince, Dawson. This regime sort of, once they've moved on, or cricketers from a previous regime, they're always looking forward. Do you agree with that? Or can cricketers go back, reinvent themselves, say, this is what I needed to do? You can pick me again now, surely.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think you should rule anybody out unless it's for, kind of other reasons. Somebody has behaved appallingly, or whatever. There's just a point where you might have to say, okay, enough. But no, because when you get dropped, and there's rarely anybody in the history of the game who's never been dropped, maybe Don Bradman, but not many others. Most people have a bit of a struggle at some stage, get dropped. And when you do get dropped, you hope to have that conversation with a captain or a coach to say, okay, what can I do better to get back in the side? And therefore, if you do that and transform yourself, we had Dom Sibley on the podcast, didn't we?
Yeah.
And he talked about some of the struggles that he'd endured as a cricketer, mental struggles, which you like to think, because he was open and interesting talking about that, you like to think that maybe he might find a way of coping with those pressures better second time around. But also he talked about the technical changes that he's made from, that very odd looking technique that we all saw when he played in England colours, to something a little bit more perhaps orthodox and repeatable, and something that will stand up under pressure at the elite level. So if you do make those changes and you do improve, because a career trajectory is never just a flat line, you'll go through peaks and troughs, and good players will try and improve and change and become better. So I think you have to be open-minded as a selector, and recognize and realize when somebody is better now than they were. Otherwise, I played 2 tests, was left out, having not done so well in 2 tests. And, if a selection panel had just said, right, that's it, he's not good enough, we're never going to look at him again, you think at 21, that would be a little bit harsh. So everybody must have the chance to go away, improve, get better, and by knocking the door down through volume of runs or number of wickets, must have a chance to come again. Which is a good time, I guess, to bring in our guest this week, who is Luke Wright, the national selector. Well, I mentioned that our guest this week is Luke Wright, the national selector, who's been in this role for a couple of years. Luke, thanks very much for joining us. You've been quite low key, haven't you? Before we talk about that and how the selection panel works now, myself and Nas were just chatting about performances in the last round of county championship cricket. We talked about Dom Sibley making a couple of hundreds and the ability of players to come back having been left out. Is there ever a scenario where you draw a line under players, whether it be Sibley, Bairstow, or whoever, or is it always an open chance for players to return?
No, thanks for having me on, firstly. No, absolutely. I don't think you ever draw a line under anyone. I've heard obviously Brookie talking about, as you said, Johnny earlier. I've spoken to Johnny on numerous times, spoken to him recently. And look, ultimately, if people are playing well enough, then, you never draw a line under people. I think the one thing that you notice in county cricket as a whole is everyone develops at different stages, don't they? And there's not many cricketers, I don't think, in any of our time that haven't been dropped at some point and almost been better for it and you come back. So no, absolutely, you never draw a line through someone, but you're still looking at the same things as a player of what is what they're doing now going to improve on what they did before, or are they going to fit into the style of play we're playing now? So no, absolutely not. And it's great to see people are sort of putting those performances that get people considered.
Um, your title is national selector. Previous national selector was Ed Smith, who seemed to be a little more high profile than you. Often when teams or squads were picked, it was Ed who was put up to kind of explain the rationale behind selections. I might be wrong, but I haven't heard you do too many of those. Those press conferences. So you're a little more low key, perhaps, than Ed and maybe some other head selectors before you. Just explain to listeners how the system works now. Who are the selectors? What is the selection panel? And where does that balance of power lies? If Ben Stokes says, I want X, and Luke Wright says, X is no good, let's have Y, is it X or Y that get picked?
Yeah, well, I think, when I went for the job with Keezy, one thing he wanted to get away from was having, that title of head selector that you get the final say and everything. He didn't think that worked. We felt that, for my job, I'm part of the selection panel for every form. So, that's myself and Rob Key and the captain and coach. And to be honest, it varies on who gets the final say. Most times I like to think that we're very aligned and, there's no real disagreements. But I think Keezy wanted to get away from it just being all put on one person. The truth be told, at times it's captain and coach get exactly what they want, the final say. There might be a time of the players coming in that I get a final say or Keezy does. So it does vary. And ultimately Keezy's the one that knows who's accountable for selections. But I think that varies. And it's sort of the way that when I went for the job, I didn't want to necessarily be out there being, front and center. I very much wanted to be in the background and working along, mostly in county cricket, working with the Lions and trying to really feed in for the next players coming into that team. Obviously, with Baz being overseas coach, he's not going to know county cricket as well as I do. And so I see that as a fundamental part of my role is being the sort of eyes and ears for county cricket, and then being that role obviously with the team on selection as well. So it varies. I think my roles change from probably other previous selectors, but I like to think there's a good benefit within that.
Tell us how your average selection meeting works. I mean, do you still have a selection meeting in person the week before a test match? So, for example, in my era, Ath era, week before a test match, weekend before a test match, myself, David Graveney, chairman of selectors, Jeff Miller, a couple of scouts would sit round, maybe with a glass or something, and the first class averages, and mess it up completely and pick the wrong side. How does it work now for selection?
Yeah, well, I think by the time we get to Baz, I would probably say it's almost summarizing where we're getting up to. I mean, let's be fair, in Test cricket, you're not debating lots of different positions. It might be one or two places in the squad. But I think from my point of view, leading up to that, there's been a lot of the work done, whether it's the analytics side of it, who the scouts that we've got. We've got a number of scouts that are anything from 13 within the championship to second team cricket to academies. And I think when you come down to selection, ultimately we're discussing one or two people. So yes, we do all to get together for the squad. And then once it gets just sort of 2-3 days out, we then discuss again of what that actual 11 looks like. And as I said, there's not many two times you don't go with the captain and coach on what they want for the 11. So there is a process always around that. And it's probably not that different to how it's been done before.
And who makes the good and the bad phone call? The good, you're in, see you at Trent Bridge, you're playing against Zimbabwe, or the bad one, you've not made it?
No, so Baz wants to take that on. He always felt, and to be honest, I understand that. The first person, when I originally started doing the job, I was doing the good and the bad calls. But ultimately, the players want to speak to the coach straight away. They know the coach, whether he wants you in or not. So Baz has actually taken most of that on, and then I follow up calls, whether that be for how they can get back in, the process of what it's going to look like. Is it going to be lines cricket, areas of improvement? But the initial call now is done by Baz.
Can I ask about data and analytics? The pendulum often swings depending on who's in charge. The perception, and tell us whether this is an accurate perception, is that Brendan and Ben are perhaps less driven by data and analytics than some other, which is not to say they ignore it, but maybe, on the spectrum are just less driven by it. As Nas said, back in the day, you basically had the first class averages because there wasn't much more available than that. But now obviously there's weighted averages. Every ball is streamed. You've got the Hawkeye data or iHawk data from the umpires. How much of that is available to you? How much do you take in? Or is it part of your job to kind of sift through all that stuff so that by the time you get to the key meeting, you're not putting too much on Ben or Brendan or whoever it may be?
Yeah, exactly that. I think, if I went to a meeting and start doing a 2-hour presentation on from the analysis, I don't think I'd be in this job very long. But the exactly, I think there's a place for both. I think as I said, going back to me being sort of the eyes and ears of county cricket, I think, of course, stats, you can't ignore stats. So you that's where I'll have a breakdown of all the stats, and you go and watch the player, don't you? It only tells so much. Sometimes someone's not getting as many runs, but we look at people like Michael Vaughan, who someone saw something in him that stats might not have necessarily backed up. And you get the other side of it where someone's absolutely knocking the door down with stats, and you go and watch them and you just think maybe it doesn't look quite right for international cricket. So I spend a lot of time on the road. I'm at pretty much every county game, and we'll watch it through it, and there's nothing you can't get away with now. I'm delighted when I played, it wasn't it didn't show as
Aren't
much.
we all?
I think, the amount of times I think I used to have to lie to my dad about how I got out. I think he must have thought I got so many good balls, but now you just cannot get away with it. So, even if I'm not at the game, I've got, if I'm at a certain game live, I've still got 2 or 3 screens up, and the live streams, an absolute godsend in my job. And if you're not watching it, then you get home and you can watch through everything. So from a player's point of view, there's nothing that's not seen. And even with Keezy, I mean, for he's an absolute badger, isn't he? So the amount of times he's supposed to be away with his wife somewhere, and he's texting and videos and showing it, there's everything showed. So I think there is, going back to the question, there is a mixture of all, but I think by the time we get to those selection meetings, it's really trying to summarize and break it down to 1 or 2 players that we're talking about, to make selection easier.
Can I put a couple of criticisms to you that is often made around the current setup? One of them is that there is a disconnect between selections for the national team and county cricket. You said you're the eyes and ears of county cricket. That is your key role, really, feeding in to Brendan, Ben, whoever, what is happening around county cricket. But the perception is that what's happening in county cricket is less relevant now than it was. So to take the well-known example of Shoaib Bashir, really, who, suddenly appears, I think on a little, social media clip Ben Stokes sees it, WhatsApps Rob, and within 5 minutes he's selected for the Lions camp in Abu Dhabi, and then on the India tour. Now that selection has worked out pretty well. 49 wickets last year for Shoaib Bashir in Test cricket. But I just use that as an example of how almost county cricket is sidelined. And that's one of the criticisms, that no matter how well you do in county cricket, that the selectors sometimes make a determination that type of cricketer is not right for county cricket. How do you respond to that criticism?
No, look, I think county cricket's hugely valuable. That's exactly where we're getting the players from, isn't it? And I think it depends on what position you're looking for. Where in regard to spin, let's be fair, we're lacking a lot of options in that regard. So we had to think out the box. That's why there was that training camp and extensive camp in the UAE. And I went there myself as part of that, and it was almost like a trial bar spin. Pick as many spinners as you can, and let's dust up the wickets, and let's put people under pressure. And from that, it was actually Bashir that was the one that we thought was the most exciting. And look, within that, you've got to take a punt. I think we were in that position, almost forced to find that spinner that was going to make a difference. And Bashir, as you said, has done really well. I think it's difficult. Obviously then when Bashir wasn't necessarily playing county cricket, to say, well, does that mean we completely disregard county cricket? Absolutely not. But you're going on your gut feel sometimes. And that's not to say that there's other people that are picked through what they do in county cricket. We've heard the name, obviously, Sam Cook being mentioned a lot. And if you look at what he's done in county cricket, it's absolutely phenomenal. So there'll be people that get picked on what they've done in county cricket, and there might be some people get picked, a Bethel, who you just see absolute raw talent at times, where you go, look, this guy's, we think ready to go, and you pluck one. But to say that we don't, value county cricket, I think is not right.
But on what you see, I mean, county cricket is played very early season, as it is at the moment. We've had 2 rounds, and often late in the season. That obviously has an impact upon conditions, type of pitches we play on, that tend to the slow side from what I can see. Number of county games that you go to in the early season, you just don't see a bouncer bowled. Does that mean that the conditions upon which performances are produced are so different that in fact you have slightly moved away to prioritizing maybe performances in other areas, like the Lions camp, the Lions teams? Lions went to Australia this winter, presumably in preparation for some of them for the chance of the Ashes next year, and the young Lions, that those pathways have slightly increased in importance, say.
Yeah, I think it's always, whenever I'm watching, like you say, if it's taking a batter, for example, you're looking at 3 or 4 things, aren't you? You're looking at technique, when obviously I know Keezy and Baz talk about it a lot, this being able to soak up pressure. So what's his defense like? Has he got good enough technique to be able to keep the ball out? Then can you put the pressure back on? Obviously, can you hit the ball on the top of the bounce? And I think for all of us that have played international cricket, the amount of pace goes up, and obviously the quality in spin. So as you said, playing the short ball, I think at international level is a hugely important thing. And you don't always get to see that in county cricket. What I try and do is, if there's overseas or in certain teams, if they have got a higher pace bowler, you're trying to prioritize watching them under those conditions. And, sometimes it might not be in county cricket. Let's talk about, if we go back to Bethel again, it was suddenly watching him in the 100 facing Jofra Archer bowling 90 mile an hour, where you go, look, I've seen enough bits in counter cricket with his technique and his defensive technique to think there's a hell of a player here, but what's it like under extreme pace, which he's not necessarily going to get in counter cricket. So I think you're trying to be smart in those moments when you pick. And if it's not in counter cricket, or it's not in the 100 or the blast, it might be that we get people on the lines. And that was another, this winter, getting over to Australia and seeing more pace and bounce. One, I think it gives us a chance to assess where they are, but as much as that, it was great for some of those young batters that we did take to actually assess where they are. And a number of them said, it's an area they want to work on and improve, which is good, because it's not just about picking players for now. It's also in 3-4 years time, can some of these guys be ready to go?
I'll talk to you about the character of players as well. I mean, I spoke about our selection meetings a long time ago. We moved away from those stats and we started to talk about the character of individuals. What would they be like at 20 for 2 with Shane Warne and Glenn McGrath running in? What would they be like coming on to bowl 100 for none or whatever? So pick on character. I think that's been noticeable, especially last summer. I know you personally were big on Gus Atkinson. The two lads that came in, both Surrey players, Jamie Smith and Gus Atkinson, impressed us not just with their ability. We'd seen that in county cricket, but their character. They looked tough. Just the way they celebrated wickets or runs or whatever, they looked to the manner born. How important is that side, and how do you find out about the character? Or is it a bit fingers crossed? What will they be like on the big stage?
No, I think that's going back to my job interview. That was one of the biggest things, I spoke about, and I thought that I could bring as a player that's recently played the game. I think one thing I learned playing international cricket, but franchise cricket, was those top players. It was exactly that. It was the character. Talent gets you so far, but it's the character. We've all seen lots of talented players get to international level and crumble. So when part of that reason is why when we go on the Lions trip, I go there as a coach. It was something I wanted to do. I wanted to be in the change room, be in the nets, because I felt that for me gives me a great insight. And also, when you're there as a coach in the change room, it's not seeing a player necessarily when they're doing well. How do they come about when they've got a couple of noughts or a few low scores? How do they react to that? How do they hold themselves? How do they go about their training? And it's something that Baz is huge on, that culture about, not just the person, what they're like as a character in the change room, what's their cricket like. So it gives me a chance being, there as a coach, to be able to give a real rounded view. So yes, I think this player is super talented, but actually I think their character's ready to go. I've seen how they train. This will fit into the environment that you guys are looking to build. And I think that's been probably one of the biggest successes of why a lot of these players going on, whether it's a Josh Tong, whether it's a Atkinson, Cast, any of these guys that have gone into that environment and so far been able to perform well. So that's something that I think for my role, we've probably changed that hasn't been done before. And I feel like there's a massive benefit from doing that.
One of the other criticisms is that it's just a closed shop, that it's harder to get out of the team than in the team. Now, we played in an era, myself and Nas, you were a bit later than us, where selection was just a revolving door. I think I played in an Ashes series in 1989 when 29 players were selected, and one 4 years later when the 23 were selected or something. One understands that clearly that is not conducive to a good environment. But is there a danger that the other way, if you go to an extreme the other way, can be not conducive as well, that there has to be pressure put on players to perform? So if we take the obvious example of Zak Crawley, people just say, well, he's inked in regardless. He's going to be there for the Ashes regardless. A, is that how the selectors see it? And B, how do you balance that balance really between too much chopping and changing, but also keeping things fluid enough to keep people on their toes?
Yeah, I think you're always better to have one game too many than you are one game too less, aren't you? We've all, like you said, we've all played in those teams where you're constantly chopping. I remember sat with Ian Bell, who had played about 200 odd games, and I was early in my career, and he'd get a 30 or 40 and suddenly like, that should get me one more game to get to the next one. Just think it's absolutely crazy way to do. But no, I understand what you mean. I think for whenever you're looking at any players, if you're taking Zak Crawley, for example, of course, I'm sure he'd be the first one to say he wants to be more consistent. But the one thing Zak's done is play well against the best people, the best teams in the world. He's proven that, when he's been under pressure. I think going into that Ashes series, I'd not been long in the job, and the amount of pressure he was under going into that Ashes series, to go and show, what he did, the mental resilience, the character to go and perform as he did under so much pressure, obviously gives him more time. I think that's the right way it should be. I think from, again, going back to my job, is to make sure then you're pushing who else is next, who else there is out there as well. Because, we all think it is better when there's other options and people are under pressure. You should feel that. And it's nice when you're able to go into those meetings and talk about 3, 4, 5 batters that are performing well, that should there be injuries or should there be, severe loss of form, then there's other people that hopefully are ready to take their opportunity. But in regarding to Zak, it was great to see him get some runs in the last innings. As much for him, I thought he looked really good. He definitely should have gone on and made it a big one once you get in, but it was great to see him get some runs, and hopefully he can kick on now.
It's quite a tricky balance to know, isn't it? I was in New Zealand for the test series there, and I would have been absolutely fascinated to know, had there been another test match in that series, a 4th test match, whether Zak would have been picked, because he looked like he was at the end of his tether at that game. He'd been put under severe pressure by one particular bowler. But I don't really want to bang on about Zak, but that coming to the point where a player almost needs to be taken out of the firing line. We've seen that from time to time with players. That is a very, very tricky call to make, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think going back to that selection of, the one nice thing is when people come in, they know it takes a while maybe to get into the team or into the squads, but you're going to get a run. That's the benefit of when people have to be patient. The next player in knows he's going to get a good run as well. And I think, that's why this team has done really well under Baz and Stokesy, because they feel trusted. They feel that belief in the side to go out and play the way you want to play. And it's going through those moments of dips in form where they've got your back. You're not playing for your career every time you go out to bat, which I think's been a massive improvement from what we've had before. But that's the call for when Brendan and Stokesy are out there. That's for them to see. Sometimes it can just be form, and you just persevere with a player. And there's other times, like you say, where you see someone who just needs a rest. The head's gone or whatnot. So I certainly don't think that Zak's in that position at all. And it's just a case of getting back in form, and as I said, it looks like he's started to do that.
What about communication with counties? You will be looking at a player that you want to play in a certain position. So, like, for example, Shoaib Bashir, the last couple of years may not be playing, but you need him to get a bowl. Or even this summer, say Jacob Bethel wasn't on the IPL. Would you be speaking to the county to say, look, he's going to be maybe batting number 3. We'd like him to bat at number 3. Or do you just leave counties to run their ship how they want to, and you do what you want to?
Yeah, similar. I obviously heard Keezy talking with you guys last week, and it's very similar. Obviously I'm always in dialogue with all the counties about each players, not just the ones we've got in the England setup, but also some of the young kids that we see in it, whether it's second team. So look, we are talking to them about certain roles, but ultimately it's up to them where they play them. We're certainly not going to dictate and say Bethel has to bat 3. They'll bat him wherever they want to bat him. They've got their own comps to win, and but obviously when it comes to us chatting to the players or with DOCs, we ideally like that, but that's not the way that it works.
Do you have to be flexible as a selector? Because like 2 years ago maybe, and we've seen it with your selection, we've seen it with what Rob Keir's had to say at the beginning of summers, where he said, I'm not interested in any other stats apart from what pace the bowlers are bowling. That is one eye on Australia and the Ashes. That is one eye. You can't bowl medium dobbers in Australia. You need pace, you need height. So you go Josh Hull at the end of last summer ahead of Sam Cook, who's getting his wickets at 19 apiece. And you mentioned Sam Cook. But recently, looking at recent series in Australia, those medium, fast, skillful bowlers with the newer Kookaburra ball are doing things, and the spinner isn't doing so much. So have you had to rethink and reset your goals for next winter, and how you select and the type of cricketer you're selecting?
Yeah, I don't know if it's completely reassessing of what we're look, pace has been a big thing in Australia, but also when you look at what we did on the Lions, Sam Cook was in that process. We have never not thought about Sam Cook, and I think going back to that, chats of whether it's DOCs or players over the last couple of years, I've spoke to Sam Cook a lot. Each time we picked someone else out of county cricket, we picked the phone up to Sam Cook to sort of explain why. And I think going back even to that whole decision, we wanted a point of difference at that point. You know, Wood had gone down. We needed a point of difference. It was explaining to Cookie that you're competing with the likes of, you know, Wokes or Potts and those guys. You want a varied attack. And look, there's certainly those guys that are bowling with high skill, not necessarily 85 plus, but they've still got, you know, a definite part to play in a bowling attack. And people like Sam Wokesy are going to be massive going into Australia. And that's why it was great chatting to someone like Sam Cook pre-winter. And I give him a lot of credit. He gave up going off to franchise cricket to try and prove his point again in the Lions. And it's brilliant when we get players that want to do that, because we get a lot of guys that turn us down for franchise cricket. So when you get players like him who you know, get away from just the money side of it, and prove their point, and that's exactly what you want as a selector.
And who has taken your eye over the couple of rounds? We've had 2 rounds. There've been some really interesting games of cricket, actually, and some that have gone right down to the wire. We've seen quite a lot of spin bowl. I mentioned before you came on to Nas, you know, Calvin Harrison bowled 50 overs in that second innings at Old Trafford, which was great to see for a leg spinner at such a start of the year. Who has taken your eye a bit from all the county cricket that you've seen?
Do you know what? I think there's been a lot. I think, as you said, the weather's definitely helped. I think it's made for really good cricket. And the one thing I do like as well, there's a lot of counties that have given a lot of the young lads a chance. And I think you want to mix, you don't you, of those senior players in, but you do definitely want a pathway of some of these young guys coming through. So, you know, for us, it was great seeing, even to a point, there's a young lad called Kai Smith. I don't know if you saw him play for
Warwickshire
Warwickshire.
keeper.
Yeah, and I think that's where those, you know, our scouts and coming from some of the academies and second team, I've heard about this Kai Smith a number of times. His name's come up. So to see him get a go and play against Potsy in that epic game that there was, and back the way he did under pressure in both innings, actually, he's someone that I suddenly just stood out. And you go, wow, what a talent he looked. But there's other guys. Max Holden obviously played brilliantly. You know, there's a lot of guys that we've actually had in our system already that have played either through, you know, the Lions or the first class counties games. Lyndon James, who was with us, batted really well and got his 100 started to come through. Freddie McCann. We've all seen Yates batting the opening batter, played really well. McKinney, it was another one. Obviously, we've had him this winter. We rate really, really highly. So to see him going back the way he did, and back the amount of balls he did as well. It wasn't just come in and smack it, which we know he can, but he showed a lot of ability and stuck it out for a long time. So he played really well. But there's no doubting there's a lot of talent in county cricket. I think going back early, what you were talking about, do players ever get written off? Players surprise you. You know, there was a guy, Sean Hunt, who was playing for Sussex. You know, I've known him a little bit before. Over the last couple of years, has probably struggled. And then I was suddenly at Hove the other day, and he looked a different cricketer. And every year, that you can't write people off. People suddenly surprise you and improve. So I thought that the first few rounds has been really, really good, and it shows the amount of players that are improving, but the amount of talent that is out there as well.
And specifically with the batting, Ath mentioned earlier, there's a perception that at times it can be a close shot because of the way people play. Do you have to play a certain way to get in this side? What would be your message to young batters out there who feel they have to put bat to ball? Would an old-fashioned grinder, you know, Michael Atherton, a young Michael Atherton grinding out scores, will they still catch your eye?
Yeah, and you know what? I've actually spoke to a number of players and a few senior players about this recently. I won't say names, but asking about their style of play. Well, does that sort of rule them out? And I think there is a bit of a misconception that suddenly, you know, player thinks they've got to run down the wicket and smack it, and a lot of the messaging, you got to play your best game. And I think we found that with Rooty, didn't we? Like Rooty went through that whole period where trying to almost be something he wasn't. But the one thing that Rooty can still do is, you know, when the right time comes, he can put bowlers under pressure in his own way. It doesn't mean that he has to be running down and hitting sixers. And I think that's the message that I'm often giving to players. Look, runs are always going to be your currency, but at the right time, if the situation is right, can you put the bowlers under a bit more pressure? Can you hit the ball on the top of the bounce? It doesn't mean you've got to do something silly or crazy. I think that's been the biggest thing in my role, is actually getting round to some of these players and explaining what the so-called baseball looks like. You know, you can be the best version of yourself. So absolutely, you know, it doesn't mean that a player who's looking to bat time isn't going to get picked, but can they add to their game that little bit more that might be the difference to get them picked, you know?
And finally, for me, are you enjoying the role? I worked as captain with some selectors who, because they were a little more high profile than you, were at the sharp end of it, getting the brunt of media criticism day in, day out. Ray Illingworth, Ted Dexter. In a way, they were kind of there to be shot at because they were significant figures, you know, former England captains, as it were. And obviously, know you played for England a fair bit, but you weren't perhaps, you know, of that reputation. But also because of what you said at the start, the fact that you haven't been put out there, that you are a little bit more low key, that your role involves almost a background role, picking up information and feeding that in. Does that make it a more enviable role than perhaps Ted Dexter or Ray Illingworth had back in the day?
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I absolutely love the role. I mean, to be at the front for English cricket, you know, I think the moment you're not in the England team, you become a fan again, don't you? So once I was getting to retirement with Sussex, and to get involved and to help shape, hopefully, English cricket in a good way. And for all of us, it's not just about the now. You're trying to plan for the next 4 or 5 years. So look, I absolutely love the role. I mean, what better role to get out of bed and go and watch county cricket or go and watch cricket? And I always thought I took a lot of joy out of performing well or winning games myself when I played. But there's no better feeling, I'll be honest, than following a player, getting to know a player. They come on the Lions, you get to know everything about them to the point where they make their debut or get called up into the England side and then go and perform. That's what it's all about. You know, of course, you know, for me, we want to win ultimately as well, but not just winning. That feeling of getting players go in and perform well, whether it's a Bashir or a Gus Atkinson's and these, like, that is a special feeling. And it's one that I hope I can keep doing well and keep finding more talent. But I feel incredibly lucky, and I'm trying to enjoy it as much as I can whilst I'm still in the job.
And selection must be a happy place at the moment. Super Kent going well. Rob Key's Super Kent, 2 from 2, and Sussex by the Sea have made a decent start as well.
You know what? He's been so quiet about Kent for quite a while now. I'm so happy for Smokey that he's gone in and done well, but I have to be honest, it's been a nightmare. But as you said, Sussex, I think Sussex, they're gonna be up there if they keep that bowling attack fit. They've got a good thing going down there. You know, they talk about all those young players. They've gone through that period of the youngsters and they're doing well. But yeah, it is great to see for Sussex that they're doing well. But yeah, I don't know if I can cope with Keezy much longer. You know, he started going down the ground even more now. They're winning. You know.
Well, it's great to chat to you. Thanks for joining us. Obviously, we wish you well for the summer. First test, 22nd of May against Zimbabwe. So when will you'll meet in that week before? Is Bethel going to be there, or is he going to be at the IPL?
No, they're not going to be pulling any lads back from IPL. So we'll be meeting in the next couple of weeks. It'll be done sooner than that, than a week before, actually, to get the squads. Because again, we're going to have to speak to DOC to try and give people as much time as possible to give them a heads up, and the players as well. So that'll be done pretty soon, actually, probably after the next round. And yeah, we're looking forward to it. It's a massive year coming up. There's going to be some great cricket, and hopefully we can get on a run again.
Great.
Oh, well,
Thanks
Luke.
for joining us.